right? So you are 10 minutes, almost 10 minutes late. So once again, welcome Professor Ariel for this session. So this session will be about synthesis of HBl and then heterostructures also. So in this we will discuss about the structure. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. So we are going to basically finalize the synthetic part in this talk. And as Dinesh told you, we are going to see the synthesis of HBN, hexagonal monohydrate. Thank you. And the heterostructures formation. So hexagonal monohydrate, if you remember, it has a crystal structure very similar to the morphine and graphite. The only difference being in the few layers within is that it has an A prime stacking instead of the A B stacking that has two features, one atom on top of the other one. And this very interesting material, I think, because it's an electric that has a very high thermal conductivity, which is usually it's not so common to have, and therefore we have some applications. And of course, like the rest of the two materials, it has a totally smooth surface, very nice mechanical properties, but also is chemical resistant up to a few hundred degrees even in air. So that makes chemical and thermal stability, but that makes it very interesting for a lot of applications that we discussed. So when we are talking about HBN, the main direction that the community took is basically the guidance that we got from the synthesis of graphitic materials, of graphene. And the main work, the main body of work was done in CVD approaches. There are some other MBE and such, but the main body of work was done in CVD approaches. Now, CVD here is the schematics of a typical system, the same. So the white part looks exactly the same as the systems for graphene, and some of the gases, of course, are the same, like the inert and the H2, that is usually fluo as well. And then we need here in HBN and several monohydrates to think about precursors. You remember in CVD chemical record deposition, one of the critical points is the precursors selection. And as you can imagine, the precursor selection is a bit more difficult than for the case of graphene. The case of graphene is the ideal case. Carbon, we need only carbon. There are plenty of hydrocarbons. There are plenty of solvents that have enough vapor pressures to work with. HBN is a bit more difficult. And you saw yesterday the problems associated with the precursors that we were using for DMTs, for example. When you use the wrong precursor, you have a lot of problems that you need to account for. Like, I'm talking about the solid, the metal oxide solids that are being used for the synthesis of DMTs. So here we have the same, we face the same stage, and here you can see the most common precursors used for the synthesis of HBN. So the first one is might be one of the best is the borazine. Borazine is a similar molecule, is a similar benzene molecule, but in the case of PN or PN group. And it has a 1-to-1 ratio of boron and nitrogen. This is not always the best, but this is also. So this is one option that was heavily investigated. The other one is ammonia boron. Ammonia boron is a solid at room temperature, and you can see the structure here. The gray are, of course, hydrogens, the blue nitrogen, and the pink is the boron. And so this is one of the most common precursors, and we'll talk about that. And then you have precursors for boron and precursors for nitrogen. The precursor for nitrogen is easily ammonia. And precursors for boron, of course, there are plenty of, there are few metal organics, but you have also the gas diboron, which the only problem in using it is that it is heavily toxic. So you can, not everybody can have the right infrastructure to work with it. You need to be very, very careful. And the other one, 281, is like a metal organic example. And of course, if you use one of these, you need to use ammonia in order to account for the nitrogen. So these are the most common precursors. Each one of them has its advantage and disadvantages. And when the community managed, finally, even in 2009, I told you yesterday that the move came up with this idea of growing graphene on low solubility, low carbon solubility metals. So the growth is surface negative, so you get a single layer. And if you do the same growth, with very similar conditions, you will on the nickel, which has higher carbon solubility, you end up with a few layer, multi-layer graphene layer. So the community tried to adopt the same strategies for HBM than they use for carbon, for the graphene. And therefore, they tried basically the same proposal, the same catalyst, the same metals, nickel or other transition metals, and also it's been several works where we and others tried to deposit HBM on the electric, directly on the electric surfaces. I'll talk about that in a minute. So on nickel, it was observed that it behaves similar to the case of graphene, meaning that we get always a few layers or multi-layer depending on the conditions of the group. Here you can see, for example, HBM grows as a function of time, and you can see how the number of layers increases significantly just with time. In this case, I think that it was with ammonia boron. And the same growth on the sapphire, which is a non-catalytic surface at the same conditions, we're talking here at the standard conditions of 1000 degrees. On sapphire, the results are more complicated. Instead of getting planar and highly crystalline layers, you end up with what is called the turbostratic structure. The turbostratic structure, basically, turbostratic has a large definition. If you take two layers of graphene and you rotate between them, so you start with if you start with a bilayer of AB stacking bilayer graphene and you rotate them, so you get a turbostratic bilayer graphene. So turbostraticity means refers to any disorder basically that you have in between the layers. And here you see that the layers are not exactly parallel and you have a lot of defects and the layers are bent, and therefore the the properties of the material. These materials, of course, reduce inferior than the single crystals or higher crystalline materials. So this is one, that the synthesis of nickel, and it started with the synthesis of nickel, having few layers, multi-layers, which, by the way, also graphene started with the synthesis on nickel or similar metals before they were called on carbon. Okay, so the growth of HBN pretty much mimic the advance of the growth of the graphene. And the same case for carbon also. If you try to grow graphene on the electrodes, if you don't do any special treat, and there are few limited tricks to do, you will end up also at the regular temperatures of 1,000 degrees. You will get a thermostatic film, and not an orbital and highly crystalline. So in this case, they are very similar. Now, when you have nickel, you may experience many other effects than with the case of carbon. With the case of carbon, we know that the nickel carbides are not stable, and therefore you don't get any formation of nickel carbide. If you would use different metals that have a formation of the metal carbide, you may have that in the growth, especially when you grow at high temperatures. But for the nickel, you simply don't get nickel carbide. But in the case of HBN, when you use the nickel at some specific conditions, what we have, and what we know it happens, is that some of the boron diffuses into the nickel, okay? And the nitrogen does not tend to diffuse into the nickel, so it is reflected out and we evaporate it, and therefore we lose a bit from the 1-to-1 ratio. And what happens next is that, okay, we have some growth on the surface, but the main growth, or the final growth, is coming from the segregation of the boron to the surface and reacting with the nitrogen that is on the surface in the environment. And in many cases, what you get at the end is a layer or a few layers of the HBN and a nickel boride interface with the nickel. Okay? So this is something that happens when you work with different metals, and also many works were done with different alloys. So when you have boron, you need to take into account that you may have many other compound formation, in contrast to the growth of graphene that with carbon is less done. Another issue that is similar to the case of graphene, and I didn't mention that here yesterday, is the fact that since the boron and some of the nitrogen also diffuses through the metal, you have the possibility in some cases to grow the layer at the bottom part of the metal. What do I mean by that? So you start in this case with a thin film of the catalyst, in this case copper, but can be nickel, similar metals. So you start with a thin film, let's say on sapphire or any other insulator. And the upper surface, of course, reacts as we showed before. Some of the boron and nitrogen diffuses into the metal. You have formation of pearl-nickel, hexagonal pearl-nickel on top of the metal, and you have also some formation, thinner layers, formation at the interface between the insulator and the metal. So this is interesting because there is a big issue with synthesizing these materials on top of, I'm talking about graphene and HBM. These are easy to synthesize on the electrodes. But these materials are very hard to synthesize directly on the electrodes. So that means that when you synthesize them on metals, you must transfer them to other substrates in order to study them and make devices, for example. So in this case, if you have a direct formation of HBN on top of the dielectric, this is the dielectric, this is the metal. So then what you can do is just to etch the metal away and to expose basically the external bonding hydrogen layers on top of the dielectric in order to use it. So this is in contrast to the growth of direct growth of HBN and sulfur that I showed you before, that you get only turbostratic. You see the difference? This is not the highest quality, but still is more planar than the turbostratic ones. Okay. Although even in the turbostratic ones, you can see that there is a big difference between the first layers and then the upper layers. So, till now, we knew that nickel always leads to multi-layer HBM growth because of the reasons that I just mentioned. And now in this world, we actually recorded the formation of a single layer of HBM and nickel. So how did we do that? To be honest, we discovered that by mistake. And the reason to get a single monolayer is by a specific modification of the surface. So what I mean by that? You remember from yesterday that modifications on surfaces are very, very important in principle when we are dealing with such atomic materials that are all surface, right? So in this case, we have the surface of the nickel. Now the nickel we know that has some solubility of boron and nitrogen, so they diffuse in, and this is the main reason for getting multi-layer, because then they segregate out, very similar to the case of carbon in nickel. But imagine that you have a modification on the surface of the nickel that inhibits the diffusion of the boron and nitrogen species into the metal. And this is exactly what we saw here. Since we used then two precursors for boron and nitrogen, we could separate between them. And what we did in a very specific environment, actually it's very hard to make this. What we did is we exposed the nickel to the boron, and what happened, because of the residual oxygen in the system, and maybe residual oxygen in the surface of the nickel, what happened is that the boron reduced the nickel oxide, right? Because the boron, if you take, again, remember the elegant diagrams? So the boron oxide is quite low, nickel oxide quite high, meaning that the boron oxide is more stable than the nickel oxide, and therefore the boron can reduce the nickel for forming a boron oxide layer on top of the nickel. And this boron oxide layer inhibits the dissolution of the boron and nitrogen species into the metal. But now you may ask, okay, so but how do we grow the HBN? We have boron oxide. The metal is not exposed, so we have no catalytic events. So how the HBN grows? And the key point here is that we introduced carbon, small amounts of carbon, hydrocarbon, or even amorphous carbon that evaporates. And by doing so, it's a bit complex, by doing so, the carbon vapor reduces the boron oxide in situ during controlling the growth of the boron network. So we reduce the boron oxide of the nickel, exposing again the nickel, but just for the growth. And we don't let it to diffuse in. So because on the areas that the HBM is formed, we don't have diffusion. We have diffusion on the exposed metal, on the free metal. And therefore, we were able, even on nickel, to grow single layer HBM. So I'm not sure that this is important for technological applications, but this is important. I think it's a very nice scientific lesson in which we show that by controlling the process, controlling the chemistry of the surfaces, we can switch between different growth mechanisms. Like in this case, from dissolution and segregation to a surface and mediated growth. And of course, we show that by XPS, X-rays for the emission spectroscopy, and you familiar with that? Anyway, it's a surface type of capitalization that allows us a chemical analysis, so we can show when the boron oxide is formed, when it is reduced. And of course, top 6, which is time of flight, secondary ion mass spectroscopy, which is also a chemical, a surface chemical analysis to prove the same. Okay, but then again, mimicking the growth of the graphene and the growth of graphene in general, many groups, in the first one was, I think, a group of Jim Bong in MIT. They showed that when you synthesize, that you can synthesize a monolayer HBM on top of copper, you may get also few layers. So it's more dependent on the process than for graphene. For graphene, it's very easy to get, relatively easy to get single layer graphene over large areas on copper. You get some add layers, so you get some areas with an additional layer. But most of the area will be most of the time single layer. Very easy. The parameter window to achieve that is very large. But in this case, the parameter window is narrower. So you can get sometimes bilayers, few layers, and of course not completely homogeneous. But anyway, they managed to do so. Here you can see some of the proposed mechanism where you have again the borazine coming to the surface, some of the boron, mainly the boron diffusing in, and then forming. So you have the surface mediated growth, but also some of the segregation mediated growth. So therefore, you have a lot of times few layers, unless you really control the parameter window in order to avoid or reduce the boron solution. So again, mimicking the graphene growth. So here, you can see nice experiments where they show the domain morphology changes according to the nitrogen to boron ratio. Okay, so by reducing the nitrogen to boron ratio, when the nitrogen content is high, you get mainly a nitrogen terminated triangles. But if you increase the boron, so you start getting also the boron termination, and basically you may get also what you are supposed to get, not hexagonal domains, because this is our hexagon. And of course, again, mimicking the growth of a single layer, single crystal graphene on copper 111, as I told you before, people managed also to do the same for HBM. So So now we have also a single crystal monolayer HBN on one top. And again, so going back to the electrics, especially rough sapphire, the reason for using sapphire is that is the magic kind of substrate. It is very stable, chemical and thermal, and it is used for epitaxial growth of the other thin films, not only 2D, of course, gallium nitride and so on. So it's very resistant in this environment. And again, if you grow on the electrodes like sapphire at low temperature, usually what you get is osmotic. If you increase the temperature, again, limiting the growth of the filler of filling. On the electrics, if you increase the temperature to 1400 and up, so you starting to have very nice and high quality HBM and sapphire directly on the dielectric. But usually to get that, achieve that, you need higher temperatures. Another approach, which is also interesting, is the one that is shown here. So as you can see here, you can see that we have the hexagonal gold nitride layer, we have the sapphire. This is a cross-section here, of course, and we have aluminum nitride. So the process that they did before the gold, they did a nitrization of they reacted basically the sapphire at high temperatures with the nitrogen, with ammonia. So they caused the formation of the aluminum nitride that seems to be favorable for the growth of sapphire. They noticed that the alignment, by the way, this is also epitaxial. At high temperatures, you can grow sapphire, the HBN epitaxially in sapphire. So therefore, you have epitaxial one and a higher quality when you grow it on the aluminum nitride. So again, comparing between the different productions, I talked only about CBD, but there are some also MBE, and CBD includes, of course, also metal organic CBD when you use the metal organic process. And you can see the cost and the crystal quality. Of course, the flake, the powder is the lowest, but the cheapest. MBE is among the highest, but more expensive, and the CBD stands somewhere almost with the MBE, but much affordable. And this is for bulk crystals, so I didn't talk about it. This is a non-millimeter to grow 3D crystals. Okay, questions about HBM? So now let's move to the heterostructures. So remember that picture of superlattice or the structure with the materials. We talked about that. Of the quantum wells that they are making. Beautiful superlattices that can be done on very specific crystals. Again, the lattice mismatch is a big issue, and also the processing. So these materials need to be compatible one with the other. But when you find the right materials to do so, and these are very similar materials, so you can get very nice superlattices at the few atom level. Now, for 2D materials, as I told you already, the picture is a bit different. In here, well, it depends how we make the heterostructure, and we'll talk about that. But in principle, we are not limited by any lattice mismatch. And you can see here the Lego concepts that the proposal of the group proposed a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. Where in principle you can look at any 2D material as a Lego piece that you can assemble together with other Lego parts, like the game that your kids, when you were a kid, were playing. And therefore to achieve different functionalities. So how we can make that? Of course, there are many methodologies, some of them well established, some of them less. And when we talk about heterostructures, we need to define that we can have vertical heterostructures or lateral heterostructures. And this concept holds only, of course, for the vertical heterostructures. So basically, we first need to produce these materials, these superlattices, these heterostructures. You may use two materials or more. You may use one repetition of several cycles, and then ideally we will be very interested in. I didn't talk about that. Maybe Suresh will talk about that electrical properties and devices on the modulation of the register between the layers. It is a very interesting topic in physics nowadays, where a very interesting property has been found when you just take same 2D material and just rotate it at the different angles. Mainly the different world that is opening. It's a very hot topic of research nowadays. And later on for applications, of course. So in terms of materials, of course, we talked about that. You have semi-metallic, semi-metals, magnetic materials, oxide materials, that most of them are wide bandgap semiconductors, so now some of them are lower. There's semiconductor materials like the TMDs that we saw, film, etc. So here you can see, so the first heterostructures and the heterostructures that you can make best vertically. So we are talking only about the vertical heterostructure, and that you, in this case, you are basically very, very flexible from the point of view of the type of materials that you can use. It will be by these two main methods. One of them, you use the weight transfer. Remember the weight transfer that we use to transfer the profile? So the same transfer you may use for materials that you do at the lab, at CBD, or in flakes. And then you basically repeat the process several times with different materials. So therefore, having them stacked one on top of the other as you decide. The other methodology that is very common in groups that work with mechanical exfoliation is this method, where you can see that you have a PDMS kind of half a sphere. So therefore, to avoid contact of the polymer with all the surface, and to reduce as much as possible the contact of this PDMS with the substrate. So what you do is you can, for example, in this case, is an example where first we took this PDMS and we picked a flake of niobium diselenide. We just exfoliated as we always do on the substrate, and we came with the PDMS and picking it up. Okay, so this is this stage. And then with the niobium diselenide, we come to another sample of tungsten ditelluride. And we do the same, but now the PDMS does not touch the tungsten ditelluride, but the niobium diselenide. So you come and pick the flake. And this you can do, of course, under a microscope. It's not something that you can do without seeing the flakes, because these flakes are very small, and this is exfoliation is basically a statistical approach, and therefore you need all this to be under a microscope, and you need to localize the white flakes and pick them up, and then you can look if you manage to pick it up. You basically see that there is nothing left, or that the thickness of the flake that was on the substrate is thinner because you peel some of the layers. Okay, and then you come with this, with any stack that you want. You can continue and pick other materials. Of course, it sounds maybe easy, but it's not easy, and it requires a lot of more. And then you basically localize your device and place the material on the device. Of course, then later on you may do other processing to deposit other contacts and so on. But this is the starting point. So here you have the wet transfer mainly for CVD4 materials, and then you have the white transfer, PDMS-based transfer done on the exfoliated flakes. Very hard work, but doable. Not only doable, but the group in I think the group in Chicago, they proposed a robotic machine that can do exactly that. You first start with your material, you cut it in pieces, so basically you make your pixels, and then with the robot you basically pick any pixel that you want of any color. Every color is a different material, and with a specific order. You may rotate between them, you may just align them, and then here you can see some examples of one on top of the other. Here you have rectangles of different sizes, one on top of the other. Here you have different structures that are shifted. And in this one you can see that the shifting is with specific angles, which is really important. You have the ability to rotate the layers before you pick them up. Very important for this field of study of the twisted 2D materials. It's very important to be able to twist it and to control the angle. Okay? Sometimes it's very high, you need to be very precise. So from the growth perspective, there are several ways that you can do, and there are a lot of work. You may, if you're interested, I think that this is a review, I'll show you later. Anyway, there is a wonderful review about heterostructures from any point, from the synthesis, applications, etc. So I will show you only a few examples for that. So here you can see basically a sequential growth one after the other. And the way that they did that, actually they did a fairly simple growth in this case. It's not CVD, it's not MOCVD, it's just sulfurization of a thin film of metals. So they made very thin metal films on substrates by sputtering. I didn't talk about sputtering, maybe I should have talked about sputtering. Anyway, with this method, in some cases you can make very thin layers, and then by doing that, after making each layer, they basically sulfurize it. And then they deposit the second metal film and they sulfurize it. and they keep going, or they sulfurize them all together, as I showed you in an example yesterday as well. And the thing is that they basically design that in the order that fits the growth temperature of the different materials. According to this work, for example, the platinum telluride requires the lowest temperature, below 500. So that means that's why they do it at the end. Okay? Because then, in order to synthesize the platinum telluride, they need to heat at less than 500, so they reduce the chances of damaging the previous layers. So therefore, they start with a higher temperature grown material, which in this case is the tungsten disulfide, and then they continue with the others that require lower and lower temperature, and they finalize with the platinum and the selenite. And by that, they basically manage to grow. Yeah, I know this is a different. Yeah. They manage to grow a few layers stacked with different PMDs in this case. And this is a relatively easy work.
What is the purpose of considering the ring form, sir?
What is what?
What is the purpose of considering the ring form?
So
you said LED rings, right? So what is the purpose of considering the ring form? The square part, the platinum.
In the ring?
Ring. You said rings, right? LED rings, the top title.
Oh, sorry, the title is wrong one. Title is wrong one. Sorry. I missed it. Now here there is no lead here. Lead is low energy electron diffraction. Here there is no lead. They just made the heterostructures of many different PMDs by sulfurization, which is a relatively easy process to do.
Also, for metallization, for every metallization stage, you are using
Sputtering, yes. Sputtering, sputtering is used also for sputtering is one of the only PVD methods. Maybe there are others, but the most available method that can lead to very thin layers on specific material systems. Here, when you deposit metal on metal, they have a high addition, so high wetting. So therefore, it is possible to deposit very thin films. I'm not sure if you will be doing that on the electrics. If you do that on low temperature or low temperature, and achieve such a thin film. Because usually in PVD, the rule of thumb is that you need I didn't talk about the formation of the films, but you need about 10 nanometers in order to have a continuous film, and that's because of wetting, basically wetting of the material that you're depositing on the substrate. If the wetting, so if the surface energy of the substrate is very high, so usually it will accommodate the new material in order to diminish and to reduce the total energy of the system. It's like the wetting. Are you familiar with the wetting? Wetting of drops, right? If the substrate is a high energy substrate, so the liquid that you put usually will cover. It will have a lower wetting angle. But if the substrate is very low energy, it will not like to cover itself with anything because it's already low energy. Therefore, the wetting angle will be high. So it's the same concept when you deposit thin films. Therefore, you need even in PVP on the surface that you are depositing the material, of course. When you deposit metals on metals, they tend to have a high additions and therefore good wetting. If you deposit metal on the electrics, you need to be careful. In order to achieve lower than, like in this case, they did like a few nanometers, you need to be, you need to prepare the surface and to design the surface carefully. So again, when you, as you're scaling down, surface is the dominating in anything, not in properties, in the formation of fields, in everything. All the materials on the bicycle are becoming all surface. So there is no bulk. It's so small that everything is surface. Okay, so this is about it. And then you have this group in Chicago. Okay, never mind. That actually they are the ones that first published the meta-organic deposition of TMDs. And they show that, remember that in meta-organic, using a volatile precursor in the CVD, you can take it out from the reactor, and therefore you can switch it on and off as you wish. Okay, but just a gas delivery system. And this is exactly what they did. So first they grew a continuous layer of tungsten, exposing the tungsten carbonyl, they grow the tungsten disulfide, and then they grow the molybdenum disulfide, and they come back to the tungsten, and so on and so forth. And also, this is not so easy to make, first, and second of all, there are a lot of things with issues with the cross contamination. But doable, as you see here. Here you can see a cross section of the red is the tungsten, and the blue is the molybdenum. Okay, so meta-organic CVD is also an option to make directly heterostructures. But as usual in CVD, we are a bit limited to the material system that we are able to go. Otherwise.
So what is the ml stands for there?
Sorry?
What is ml? What is to ml?
What is what?
ml. You mentioned.
ML is monolayer.
Good.
Monolayer. One layer. And then you have many other works showing the formation of the lateral heterostructures. So think about that. Having a 3D, a 3-atom thick layer that's a 3-atom thick junction between two different materials. In this case, what's that? They were playing, sorry. Okay, they were playing here with the molybdenum and tungsten, like selenite. They were playing with the composition of the molybdenum and tungsten in the domains, and also making all kinds of heterostructures. So therefore, you can basically change the band gap, as you see here in these schematics, by modulating the composition of the metals during the growth. And of course, creating all kinds of heterostructures, lateral in this case, heterostructures. So this is possible. This was done by the metal oxide type of CVD, not by the CVD. Another, yes? Yes.
That tungsten sulfur granite has been synthesized in the state.
So this is a theoretical work showing the bands, and this is an experimental work in which they switch the composition during the growth. So therefore, they were able to grow, for example, first 185. I guess is the blue. You see? So the blue, the green is with the composition 1, so this is the MOS2, MOSC2, probably. This is the hydrogen, so it comes in the sulfide, right? And then they started to play with the composition. So here they show one growth in which, after the growth of their tungsten disulfide, they grow an alloy with this composition of 0.28, right? And then you can see different combinations of it.
How to manage like that composition in CVD?
It's very hard. This is something that you can estimate the composition. You can estimate XC2. So you change the composition during the growth. For example, you can do it by many ways, even with the powder precursors. You may set a manifold in which you flow selenium and sulfur separately. Then you switch between them. The tungsten and moly, and when you switch between the metals, is more difficult because this guys needs to be really close to the substrate because of the evaporation temperature. But the selenium and sulfur, the hydrogen, needs to be placed upstream in the colder region. You need to heat it up to 150, 250 degrees, right? So you can control it separately.
Sir,
It's not easy, and it's not easy at all, and you can estimate the composition only after the growth.
Yes, of course. Actually, I just tried for rhenium and sulfur in CVD, but I was thinking about to like change that sulfur composition with selenium. Yeah, but maybe it is possible or not. But
We can look after that if you want. But so you have already rhenium disulfide. You can grow rhenium disulfide.
yeah, rhenium disulfide I have, but maybe I can simultaneously deposit sulfur and selenium with the different places, or like after sulfonizing, and then we can try selenite. So it is the better way.
So in principle, the selenite is supposed to be less stable than the sulfur. So you may think about Sc2 exchange of the selenium with sulfur, maybe, or do the growth. Mix the easiest thing to start with if you're not interested in a specific composition, and I guess that you will get a lot of compositions depending on the distance between the sample and the powders, is by mixing the selenium and the sulfur. Yeah.
Both equations should be mixed.
You will need to heat them up to higher temperatures, or to heat them separately. That will be better. We can talk after that.
So the main purpose of alloying is to match the band gap of the alloyed composition.
I think that this is more like a proof of concept. To match that in the sense that they show that they can first tune the composition of the material and therefore change the band gap. And second of all, they can make with all these compositions, with any composition that you want, they can make lateral heterostructures, junctions of 3 atom thick.
Yes, yes. So the purpose is to make the device, right? So for matching the band gap. To purpose is to make it a device, a diode or like.
In this case, for example, tungsten disulfide is supposed to be naturally N-type, tungsten diselenide is supposed to be naturally P-type. So therefore, in principle, you should be able to grow lateral P-N junctions of only 3 atom thick. Is, relatively simple semilunar.
But I have seen even the in a conference I have seen even the monolayer heterostructure also I have seen monolayer lateral
This
heterostructure.
is monolayer. This is one layer. 3 atom thick
3 atom.
is one layer.
Yeah,
The number of atoms depends on the material.
Yeah.
In bismuth diselenide, you have 5 atoms. In graphene, you have 1. In these guys, you have 3. And here you have a very nice work that is related to what we talked yesterday. We talked yesterday about the defect induced formation of the add layer. I showed in my seminar yesterday even at low temperature the axial flow of an add layer that is induced by a defect. So in this case, they make the defects. So we knew that defects induce growth, but we don't really know how many defects are in the CVD materials. So in this case, they take a continuous layer of whatever material you choose. You start by laser patterning the defects as schematically depicted here. Now here, the schematics are one atom sulfur deficient. I guess that the defect is larger than that. And then once you induce the defect, they did a thermal process in which they basically they nucleate the etching pits. Okay, they make defects and then they thermal annihilate in the presence maybe of oxygen. So then to selectively etch the material and the etching originates only from the defects. Basically, they nucleate, they seed the nucleation of the etch pit. And once they have the etch pit, you can do a few things. In this case, you can grow another material, compatible material. In this case, very similar material, of course. Again, tungsten sulfide and selenite inside the pits. And if you have it another substrate, imagine that you can go other stuff depending on the substrate. But this methodology is very nice. They show very nice results. I think that this is PL imaging of the different heterostructures. And okay, so a bit of devices. So what can you make with that? Here you can see we were talking about, we just talked about lateral PN junctions. So in this case, it's not exactly lateral. The device is lateral, but the junction is more like vertical. And again, this junction is made by exfoliation, like I showed you before, exfoliation, localized exfoliation. So therefore, after the exfoliation of the stack, so you see that some of the MOS2 remains here and some here, and this is in purpose, of course, and then they come up. Here you can see the PL imaging of the structure in this color. So you can see the different materials, and these are the electrodes that were made by lithography, and therefore they can show in this case, for example, they showed electroluminescence. Okay, you can see the luminescence as a function of the current flow through the junction. Okay, so this is one example.
So, in that case, like that, since this is a vertical junction, mobility through vertical side direction is very less, right, compared to the inverse.
Yes and no, because this is only a monolayer, and you need a charge transfer. So you have plenty of charge transfer in between these two layers.
So it will happen even though you can't know
Yes.
that's a possibility.
Yes. Of course, yes.
Sir, what is the voltage difference in the voltage, like bias voltage?
What is the voltage that they apply here?
No, different, like WAC2 and WH2, there is a barrier, right? There is some barrier.
Okay, band gap.
Band gap barrier.
molybdenum disulfide is about 1.8, and tungsten diselenide is the lowest, so it's about 1.5, 1.6. In another case, with more complex heterostructure, as you can see here, again done by the Lego concept and the mechanical exfoliation. So you have HPN, graphene, and some TMDs. And in this case also they show, and here you can see the optical picture after doing the electroluminescence. Again, they make a device with a heterostructure. I don't remember exactly how they make the contacts to the heterostructure, but they can show to have a strong electroluminescence from the stack. And again, comparing that with the tungsten, with the same material, PL, they show comparable results, which is really good. Usually these kind of devices, only in this you get a lower performance. And here again you can see very complex stacks. I would say that the only thing that is harder to control would be the thickness of the HPN, and but other than that, exfoliation muscles very well. So therefore, you can transfer. Here you have only graphene and HPN. Here graphene, HPN, and also TMD. As you can see here in the cross section, PM analysis. And then here you have the schematics of the band structure of this step. We have here the substrate and the bone nitride, or the first graphene, and then the TMD, all separated by bone nitride, and then the graphene. And you can see how the bands of the graphene changes, and the bands of the TMD, of course, changes with increasing the voltage between the terminals. And you will remember the linear dispersion of the graphene. So
is it from an external result or plate?
again,
Is it from an external result?
this is the modeling of this.
Okay,
This
and what
device.
from where it can be the cell?
This is not a spectral, this is a cross-section PM analysis.
So they are doing in situ processing. Because what is their very
No, the PM is just to characterize the stack. And this is just to model how the voltage drops on the different layers. Okay.
What is the model, sir?
So
Sir, what is that model? What is that model name?
what is what?
What is the model name? How they model it?
I don't know. Here is the nice. That's it. So here again is the device. This is optical microscope before, just of the device without applying the voltage. And here is while measuring the electroluminescence. So the stack is only, all the stack that you saw before is only here in this part. All the rest are the contacts and so the layers. So this is part of the layers that are bigger, but only here you have the stack, the full stack that is measured. Okay. So, but these layers, these heterostructures, these complex heterostructures are mainly obtained, not mainly, only obtained by mechanical exfoliation. I don't know of any synthetic method to make graphene, HPN, and TMD all together. You have TMD and graphene, TMD and HPN maybe, synthetic approach is still have a lot to do. And of course, when we grow different materials, we need to take into account the compatibility between the materials, as I showed you before. For example, one of the cases that they showed you here, in which they design the process with the lowering processing temperature along the way in order to avoid as possible the damaging of the already known raw materials. Questions? Yes.
Laser patterning is good.
Again?
Laser patterning is
Yes.
we are making pattern.
In that case, it's lateral, but you can also do with similar approaches. You can do vertical. If you take these continuous fields, if you start from the continuous fields that they started, and you pattern basically the defects, basically you make, it's like a seeding, because you make the nucleation point for a second step of growth. So now you switch the material, and people have shown that you can grow a different material originating from these defects. So therefore, here in this case, you have a vertical heterostructure. In this case, for a few layers, but a vertical one. In this case, what did they did? They did the defects, but after the defects, they did some etching. And if you do the etching of the material very mildly and in the right conditions, the etching will create faceted bits like you saw in the PMD. Because these materials are crystalline and they have preferred facets, okay? So if you etch it in the right manner, very mildly, and you control that, you will make these faceted etched bits, in this case triangular because it's a TMD, and then in this case they fill it. So, but these methods are very similar in the sense that they nucleated the growth of the second material by defects. Only difference that here they expanded the defect to a pit, and here they use just the defect here in order to nucleate the growth.
So can we use electron beam also to create the packs?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that there are some more tricks that they did. Yes, you can, and I will show in the next lecture that, for example, when you do imaging in TN, it's very nice because you see the atoms and everything, high resolution imaging in TN. But in these materials, you always, I couldn't find the movie, so I'll show you only a picture. You can see the defects that the imaging, that the electron beam originates. So really, when you analyze these materials in TM, you need to be careful because you create point defects during the analysis, during the imaging. More questions? Yes? What is the difference? Okay, first of all, so the question was, what is the difference between the lateral and the vertical? Lateral heterostructure is just one atomic layer that is joining another atomic layer laterally. Vertically is like stacked one on top of the other, the another. Okay. So, so what was the question? How you characterize that? Well, first of all, the lateral is the easiest. You can do even some of the lateral junctions you can see by optical microscope, by different contrast, in SEM, in Raman, in PL. The lateral is very easy because you have two separated materials. Of course, PN, implant PN, and so on. And if you want to characterize the vertical heterostructure, you can do, we will talk in the next talk, but you can do also, you will see differences in the optical microscope, depending on the sample. You will see, in principle, in the Raman spectra, you should see both phases together because the laser penetrates single layers. So you should see the Raman signal coming from the two phases. So if you are studying one point and you see the two phases, you know that the two materials are present. Okay? And of course, if you do cross-section PN, you can do PN with TVS analysis, chemical analysis.
So, what are the ways of creating point defects? What are the different ways of creating point defects?
Point defects. First of all, point defects are created even if you don't want to. I mean, especially in CBD. CBD, after the growth, they have some density of defects, mainly point defects, mainly sulfur deficiencies. But creating, I'm not sure that these methods of laser patterning and electron beam patterning, they don't create single point defects necessarily. They create so small defects, could be more than a point defect. In TEM, you can see that if you see, there are movies. I used to have a movie where you're imaging the lattice of a TMD, and suddenly you see the atoms just kicking away. But this TM is not a fabrication method. If you really want to do point defect, I guess that STM would be the best. Come to an atom and just to kick it out. Scanning tunneling microscope is the only way. These methods create small defects, but I'm not sure that they create point defects. Actually, it's very hard to analyze, to characterize these point defects.
So, the point defects can be calculated with TEM.
What?
We can create point defects by STM. But
Yeah,
characterizing.
but it's not a fabrication mode. Also, TEM is not a fabrication mode. It's not something that.
Understood. Through STM, you create a point defect for characterization.
Yeah.
Again, we can use STM no? For characterization also.
Yes, STM. In STM, the characterization is different. In STM, you get, you tunnel current to the surface, so you get a mapping of the electron densities on the surface. And you can do spectroscopy.
Yes.
People did spectroscopy with defects and others.
So the spectroscopy is like a nano-Raman spectroscopy or
No, I'm talking about the scanning tunneling spectroscopy.
that is known as SNOM.
In the same STM, you do the defect and then you do the spectroscopy.
So that is known as SNOM, scanning near field optical microscopy. That is known as SNOM technique, scanning near field optical microscopy.
Right, yes.
So there we can do spectroscopy.
Yes, not at atomic level, but yes, very small.
Up to 50 nanometer, you can do.
Even
50, 20
less
nanometer you can do.
Even less.
But what is the typical in general? A single point defect. What is the size of the
It's one atom. It's
one atom? So I don't think with the spectroscopy technique we can do one atom.
The problem in spectroscopy is that you are sampling a larger area, right?
Yeah.
So you need in this case to have a method in which you can isolate the signal from single event, from single defects. I'm not sure that there is something like that. Actually, characterizing the density of defects in these materials is not easy at all. It's very difficult, so this is one of the main challenges.
So it gives the cumulative defect density, sir. It's not give single defect. I think it may map the multiple defects in a.
Maybe.
But in TM there is a spectroscopy. In
TM, there
we can do
are
spectroscopy in TM.
various spectroscopies.
We can do spectroscopy.
Of defects, I'm not sure that they have a fingerprint. I'm not sure that they're so easy to do. At TM you see them, of course. But in TM you also create them, as long as you do the imaging.
Yes, sir. In TM also we have scanning mode, sir. Scanning
Right.
scanning TM is
Yes,
there. So in that we can do the scanning.
Yeah.